I've never been afraid of heights. Not at all. But on that August night, stuck in my fire lookout tower deep in the Yellowstone backcountry, it finally hit me. The most terrifying threat wasn't the rustling in the black forest below. No. The most dreadful horror was the thing that was slowly but inevitably crawling its way up to me. It was my third shift as an observer at the Thorifer lookout. I had just started to settle into the strange routine. The job, to be frank, was monotonous, but in that monotony there was a special kind of silence. 6 days a week, I'd hang out in the glass cabin at 100 feet, with a panorama of the national park all around. It was beautiful, of course, but in reality, it was complete isolation. My main job was to search for smoke. I scanned the horizon with binoculars, checked the maps, and kept a weather log. And every 2 hours, I'd call Dennis, my supervisor. His office was about 60 miles away, where civilization was. Here, it was absolute detachment from the world. The nearest tourist trail was 15 miles to the west, and my area of responsibility was pure wilderness, where you couldn't set foot without special authorization. I was the only person for hundreds of square miles. Get it? The only one. August 22nd, 2003, started as usual. The morning was clear, with only a light haze over the distant ridges. I performed the standard checkup: radio, weather station, solar panels. Everything was working perfectly. In the afternoon, I spotted a small cluster of clouds to the north, reported it to Dennis, and spent the rest of the day engrossed in a book, occasionally looking up to survey my domain. The sun was setting, painting the sky in such breathtaking shades of orange and purple. Beautiful, I thought. I prepared dinner, heating up some canned soup on the gas stove. As soon as it got dark, I switched on the infrared cameras. One, on the roof, gave a 360-degree view. The other, smaller one, was aimed straight at the spiral staircase that led up to my cabin. This was a standard measure, you know, for monitoring wildlife, in case a bear or a moose approached the base of the tower. There was only one entry point into the cabin itself, a heavy steel door that I locked from the inside with a massive steel bolt. The door at the bottom, however, at the base of the stairs, was always left open. That was the rule, in case a ranger needed emergency shelter. In 3 shifts, I hadn't seen a soul. And honestly, I wasn't expecting anyone. Around 10:30 p.m., as I was just finishing the last entry in my journal, a dim yellow indicator lit up on the control panel. It was connected to a motion sensor installed in Sector 7 Bravo, about 3 miles east of the tower. This was an old, overgrown area where a logger's trail used to run, but it had been closed for over 20 years. I didn't pay much attention to it. Nah, just a moose or a grizzly wandering around, I figured. But according to protocol, I was obliged to check. I switched the main monitor to the long-range camera, pointing it in that direction. The infrared image was grainy, black and white, like an old horror movie. I twisted the zoom knob, trying to focus on the area where the sensor had been triggered. The forest was an unmoving wall. I was about to turn away and make a note about a false alarm caused by an animal when I suddenly noticed movement. Something flitted between the trees. It was too small for a moose, and it was moving, on 2 legs. A person. My first thought was annoyance. Great, I thought. Some extreme tourist decided to take a shortcut through a restricted area. A serious violation, of course, but it happened. People can be reckless. I grabbed the radio. "Dennis, this is Leo. Thorifer, over." A crackle came through the speaker, followed by Dennis's calm voice. "I hear you, Leo. What's up?" I had a sensor trip in Sector 7 Bravo, observing a single figure. Looks like a person, moving directly toward my position. There was a short pause. "A tourist?" At this hour and in that sector? Are you sure? Doubt crept into Dennis's voice. Absolutely. I see him on thermal. He's not following a trail. He's moving straight through the woods. Understood. Maintain observation, but do not make contact. He's probably lost. We'll send a team in the morning. Just log his movement. End transmission. I put the radio down and stared at the monitor again. This thing was still crawling. It moved in an unnerving way. Slowly, yet robotically, without a single wasted movement. No staggering, no stumbling. Just a perfectly smooth, even pace. Normally, if you're lost in the woods at night, you'd be panicking, scrambling around, shining a flashlight. But this thing had no light, and no hint of hesitation. It just pushed forward, as if it knew every bush, every rock, as if it were guided by an invisible thread. And the most unsettling part, it was moving directly toward me. About an hour later, the thing emerged from the thicket and stepped onto a bare, rocky plateau, right at the foot of the hill where my tower stood. Now I could see it better. A tall, skinny silhouette. No backpack, no gear, nothing. Just a black shadow against the gray rocks. And it, without slowing down, started ascending the slope. A cold shudder ran through me. This was definitely not some lost hiker. Everything about this was wrong. The route, the dead of night, the lack of equipment, that horrifyingly uniform gait, everything screamed. Anomaly. I grabbed the radio again. Dennis, it's Leo. It's out on the plateau at the base of the tower and coming straight for me. This is just mega strange. What do you mean strange, Leo? Dennis's voice remained calm, but I caught a nervous edge. It's moving as if it has a clear destination, and it seems that destination is my tower. It doesn't look lost at all. No light, no pack, nothing. Leo, lock yourself in tight up there and do not come out. Under any circumstances, understand. Just observe. We see everything from your cameras. It is locked, Dennis. I closed it at dusk. I set the radio aside and rushed to the door to check. The massive steel bolt was in place, biting into the door frame. I yanked the handle. It wouldn't budge. You could only get in from the outside if I opened that lock myself. And I certainly wasn't going to do that. I stared at the monitors again. The figure had vanished from the main camera's view. It was in the dead zone, right underneath the tower. Now the only way to see what was happening down there was the tiny camera aimed directly at the staircase. I switched to it. The screen flickered to life, showing the black and white spiral of the staircase disappearing into the abyss. The first few flights were empty. I froze, listening to the dead silence. Usually the wind howls at night here, owls hoot. But now, not a sound. Just absolute oppressive silence that was ringing in my ears. And then it. At the very bottom of the screen, on the first step, the dark figure appeared. It paused for a couple of seconds, then began to climb. Slowly, step by step, absolutely silently. The camera, by the way, had a microphone, but I didn't hear the creak of the old steps or the rustle of footsteps, just a smooth, methodical movement up. That unpleasant chill I had felt earlier turned into a block of ice in my gut. My brain frantically tried to produce some logical explanation, but no. There was no logic here whatsoever. The door at the bottom of the stairs was just a simple grate without a lock. But my door, up top to the cabin, it was locked from the inside. No one could just climb those stairs and barge in. It was physically impossible. And yet, it was climbing. I grabbed the radio. My hands were visibly shaking now. Dennis, it's on the stairs. It's climbing up. What, Leo? That can't be. You're locked in, aren't you? I know I'm locked in. I'm watching it right now through the camera. It's on the stairs and it's coming straight for me. In response, dead silence. Long, heavy, oppressive. I saw that the thing had already covered half the distance. The movements were so smooth, unnatural, almost non-human. No strain, no effort, as if climbing that steep spiral staircase was nothing to it. "Leo," Dennis finally breathed out, his voice utterly unrecognizable. "Get away from the door. Go to the farthest corner of the cabin and don't move. We see everything from your camera. We've already called a helicopter. The nearest one is an hour away from you. Just sit tight and wait." An hour? A whole damned hour. The figure on the monitor was literally just a couple of flights away from my door. I could have reached out and almost touched it if it weren't for that cursed steel barrier. I stared at the screen, mesmerized. The silhouette was becoming clearer, tall, with long, unnaturally long limbs. The face was still not visible. It was simply swallowed by a dense shadow. The figure reached the top landing and it froze right at my door. It stood there, a few feet away from me, separated only by a thin sheet of metal. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, a shout, an attempt to smash the door down, but nothing. Only a dead silence. The thing just stood there. I stared at the massive steel bolt that I myself had thrown a couple of hours ago, and listened to the deafening emptiness. Not a single sound, just a silent, terrifying presence on the other side of the door. Something that shouldn't have been there, and that refused to leave. Time melted, turning into a thick, sticky goo. Every second felt like an eternity. I was rooted to the chair, afraid to even move, hypnotized by 2 points. The frozen shadow on the black and white screen and that shiny steel pin on the door. Both things seemed equally unimaginable. My own breathing, ragged and deafening in the dead silence, echoed in my ears. Dennis's voice, promising a helicopter in an hour, sounded like it came from a past life where the laws of physics still worked. Here, in this glass trap, stuck 100 feet up, those rules apparently no longer matter to anyone. Maybe 10 minutes passed. The thing by the door hadn't moved. No attempt to turn the handle, no creak, no scratching. This was worse than any direct attack. It was a passive, waiting presence that was slowly draining the life out of me with its stillness. I tried to pull my thoughts together, to convince myself that this was some creepy, elaborate prank. But who the hell could set this up? Why drag someone out to such a remote place just to stand silently by the fire lookout door? This would be a massive operation, and the motives were completely baffling. And then, the figure on the monitor stirred. It didn't go down. It didn't lunge at the door. No. It slowly, with the same otherworldly, creepy smoothness, floated sideways, along the narrow landing in front of the door, and disappeared from the tiny camera's field of view. My heart skipped a beat. Or two. The landing in front of the door was part of the circular balcony gallery that encircled my entire glass cabin. It was barely 3 feet wide. And now, it was out there. Slowly, trying not to make a sound, I turned my head toward the nearest window. The cabin was essentially all glass, floor to ceiling for 360-degree visibility. Now this feature had become a pure curse. I felt like a fish in an aquarium put on display. Beyond the glass was pitch blackness, in which the faint light of my instruments was barely reflected. And in that reflection, I caught movement. A dark silhouette slowly glided past the window. It was moving along the gallery and I saw it sideways. Tall, thinner than it had looked on the camera, with unnaturally long, thin arms. It wasn't walking. It was more like gliding, like a ghost. I didn't hear a single step on the metal grating of the balcony. Complete silence. It was moving clockwise. I stood frozen, like a pillar of salt, following it with my gaze, slowly turning my head. It passed the south window, then the west one. I was trapped, and this predator was examining it from all sides. I grabbed the radio again, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Dennis, it's moving! It's on the balcony. It's circling the cabin. Leo, what do you see? Describe it. Nothing specific. Just a dark silhouette, horribly tall and thin, moving absolutely silently. Dennis, I don't hear it. It's walking on a metal grate, but there are no footsteps. Leo, stay put. Under no circumstances go near the windows. The helicopter is on its way. They've cut the time down. They'll be with you in about 40 minutes. Just don't draw attention. Don't draw attention, I mentally repeated, and a cold sweat broke out. I was the only damn source of light for miles around. I was a lighthouse in an ocean of pitch blackness, attracting this thing. The figure completed its ominous circle and froze by the door again. But this time, it didn't linger. After standing for a couple of seconds, it did something my brain flat out refused to process. It raised its head as if looking at the roof, and then it started to climb. I didn't see exactly how. No ladders, no ropes, nothing. The silhouette simply began to slowly shift upward, disappearing behind the edge of the window frame, as if clinging to something invisible on the smooth metal siding. A moment later, it was completely out of sight. A new phase of silence descended. Now it was even more sinister than before. At least then I knew where it was. It had crept up. Right behind the door I felt it. And now I didn't understand anything at all. Had it left? Gone down somewhere? Or did that barely audible, nasty creak, like something crawling, come from above? It wasn't a knock. It was the sound an old metal structure makes when a weight is slowly but surely transferred onto it. The sound came from the roof. It was on the roof, right above my head. Panic washed over me, a searing, sticky wave of terror. I was sitting at the very top of this damn tower. Above me were only the antenna and the lightning rod. The roof was sloped, metal. No railings, nothing to grab onto, especially in the pitch blackness. But it was there. Dennis. My voice had turned into a hoarse whisper. It's on the roof. I heard the metal creak. On the roof, Leo? That's impossible. There are no ledges, no ladder. How could it get up there? I don't know, Dennis. I'm just telling you what I heard. After that, the creaking stopped. The horrifying silence returned. I sat, pressed into the chair, and stared blankly at the ceiling as if I could see something through the steel sheets. Every second dragged on like an hour as I waited for that damned helicopter. I thought about the pilots flying toward me. They were in their world, where everything made sense. Engines, aerodynamics, instruments. And me? I was stuck in the middle of some nightmare story that defied all common sense. About 20 minutes later, I caught a distant, faint rumble. It grew louder, turning into that unmistakable, choppy thrum of helicopter blades. Never in my life had I been so happy about a simple noise. It was my lifeline, the only thread connecting me to reality. Soon, a blinding beam of light flashed in the window. It swept across the hillside, the base of the tower, and illuminated the empty spiral staircase. Then the beam rose higher and bathed my cabin and the balcony around it in light. Empty. No one. The spotlight scanned the roof. Nothing there either. The helicopter hovered a few dozen yards from the tower. A new voice came over the radio, clear and businesslike, as if from a completely different world. Thorough lookout. This is Search Team Bravo 1. We have conducted a visual inspection. Perimeter is clear. I repeat, perimeter is clear. We are lowering a ranger for a detailed inspection. Remain inside. I watched as a figure detached from the helicopter, descending smoothly on a cable right onto my balcony. A ranger in full gear. He unclipped the cable, waved to the helicopter, and got to work, methodically inspecting everything around. He walked the entire gallery, shining a powerful flashlight into every dark corner. Then he came to my door. "Leo, this is Ranger Carl. Everything's clear outside. No traces, nothing unusual. Dennis gave the go-ahead. I can come in if you open up." I swallowed. My hands were still shaking, but I walked to the door and with effort slid the heavy bolt back. The door opened, and standing on the threshold was a middle-aged man with a stern, weather-beaten face. Behind him, the helicopter hung, filling the area with a roaring sound and blinding light. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, stepping inside. "You don't look good." "It was here," I said. "On the stairs, then the balcony, and on the roof." Carl looked at me sympathetically, as at a man who had succumbed to panic in complete solitude. "We didn't find anyone, not below, not here. Maybe it was just a bear and stress." "It wasn't a bear," I interrupted him. "I saw it on camera." Carl sighed and brought his radio to his lips. "Dennis, this is Carl. I'm inside with Leo. Everything's fine here. I think we should check the roof to put all questions to rest. I'll ask the pilot to lift me up." He went back out onto the balcony, and a minute later the cable descended from the helicopter again. Carl secured it and was lifted into the air. The helicopter brought him directly to the roof and gently lowered him onto the sloped metal surface. For a few seconds he stood there, illuminating the area around him with his flashlight, and then his voice came through my radio, which I still hadn't let go of. His voice had changed. There was no usual business-like tone, no hint of panic, just a quiet, almost shocked bewilderment. "Dennis, Leo, you need to see this. I don't know how to explain it. There are footprints right here on the roof." I walked to the window and looked up. Carl was kneeling and shining his flashlight on the roof's surface. The helicopter hovered slightly above. Its spotlight was focused on the same spot. "What kind of footprints, Carl?" I asked. "Listen, Dennis." Carl finally spoke into the radio after a long, oppressive pause. They're like boot prints, but not quite. Narrow, barefoot-looking, and terrifyingly clear on the dusty metal roof. They stretch from the very edge, where there's nothing to hold on to, right to the center. And there, Carl paused for a second, and that silence was louder than any scream. And there they just stop. Two prints are right next to each other in the middle of the roof. And that's it. Nothing more. It's as if whatever left them just dissolved into thin air right above my head. His voice over the radio was like a verdict on everything we considered reality. For a few seconds, a dead silence hung in the air, only the dull hum of the helicopter blades in the background. I could literally picture Dennis, 60 miles away in his warm, safe office, trying to process this madness. Not just him, I couldn't wrap my head around it either. Footprints on the roof that just began and ended out of nowhere. "Carl, take pictures," Dennis finally exhaled. His voice was strained but level, like a person desperately clinging to protocol when the world is collapsing around them. "Maximum resolution, every print, the overall shot, the spot where they disappear, capture everything you can, and Leo, get ready for evacuation. You're not staying there a minute longer." He didn't have to tell me twice. The thought of spending another night in that glass box, knowing that something weightless and absolutely silent had walked on my roof, was unbearable. I quickly stuffed my meager belongings into my backpack, a book, a change of clothes, a thermos. Everything else, the equipment, logs, maps, belonged to the Park Service, and it could stay there. Carl stayed on the roof for another 10 minutes, methodically snapping pictures under the bright beam of the helicopter's spotlight. Then he descended onto the balcony. His face beneath the cap's visor was ashen. He didn't even look me in the eye. "We're leaving," he said curtly. "They're closing the tower for now." "The official story?" an urgent structural inspection after some seismic activity. We both knew it was a lie. But that lie was a lifeline. It created some semblance of order in a world that had just been turned upside down. I took one last look at the cabin, my sanctuary for the past few weeks. Now it seemed alien and hostile. I stepped out onto the balcony where the cable was waiting for me. A minute later, I was sitting in the roaring, vibrating belly of the helicopter that was carrying me away from the Thorifer lookout, which glowed alone somewhere below in the middle of boundless darkness. I was taken to the central base in Mammoth Hot Springs. Instead of the familiar silence and solitude, there was the bright light of lamps, bustling people, and the smell of coffee. I was immediately ushered into a small conference room where Dennis was already sitting. He looked exhausted. Beside him was another man I didn't know. About 60, in a sharp suit that harshly contrasted with the ranger uniforms. This was Mr. Evans, the park's director of security. The interrogation began. Well, they called it a service interview. Everything was extremely polite and correct. They brought water. They asked me to tell them everything from the beginning. I recounted it monotonously, without a single emotion, just listing the events of that night. The sensor activation, the figure on the camera, its strange gait, the movement toward the tower, the climb up the stairs, the loop around the balcony, the sound on the roof. I spoke like a robot, just giving the facts. They listened in silence, without interrupting. On the large screen on the wall, the recordings from my cameras were playing. There's the grainy silhouette making its way through the woods. There it is crawling up the slope. And here's the most terrifying moment. The dark figure silently climbing the stairs toward the locked door. Was the bolt secured the entire time? Evans asked in his quiet but authoritative voice. Yes, sir. I personally checked it right after the figure reached the base of the tower. And again when it was already on the stairs. Did anyone other than you have a key or access to the cabin? No one, sir. That's the protocol for solitary observers. Then the photos taken by Carl appeared on the screen, sharp, high resolution. On the dusty metal surface of the roof, a chain of dark impressions twisted. They were narrow, unsettlingly similar to barefoot prints, not the imprints of any kind of footwear. The photo showed a chain of footprints like those of shoes leading from the edge of the roof toward the massive antenna mast. Deeply pressed into the dust and grit, they looked surprisingly clear, as if left only a few minutes ago. About a meter from the base of the mast, the tracks abruptly stopped. The last two prints were perfectly side by side, parallel to each other, as if something had paused. And beyond that, absolutely clean, untouched surface. Not a single scratch, no hint of dragging or jumping. Just emptiness. My boss, Evans, stared intently at the photo. His usually unflappable face was strained. Dennis, our technician, sat next to him, hands clasped, his gaze darting between us. We've gone through all the theories, Leo, Evans began, his voice muffled. A hoax involving climbing gear doesn't explain passing through a door locked from the inside. And the nature of the footprints isn't human. The cameras weren't glitching, the motion sensor worked. Ranger Carl, the first on the scene, confirmed the reality of these prints, taking photos before the area was cordoned off. Even your exhaustion and hallucinations have been ruled out. All the evidence, paradoxically, suggests the opposite. You weren't the only witness, and your testimony matches the equipment. He paused, boring into me with a look that contained a mix of fatigue, disbelief, and confusion. We have video of something moving down the hallway, stopping in front of a locked door, and a second later, it's on the other side. And photos of footprints on the roof, where a person can't climb without equipment. And those footprints just vanish into thin air. Do you understand, Leo? None of this evidence should exist in our reality. They contradict all laws of physics, logic, and common sense. And yet, we have both, and they confirm each other. I remained silent. I had been a witness myself. I had seen this thing pass through a wall. The thoroughfare lookout is being closed indefinitely, Evans continued, his voice becoming slightly more official. The official story is structural inspection. At dawn, forensics, engineers, and specialists in anomalous phenomena will be sent there. Your involvement in the incident, Leo, is over. You are being placed on paid administrative leave, with a recommendation for a full medical checkup and a visit to a psychologist. This is standard procedure. And one more thing, Leo, he added, lowering his voice to almost a whisper. The incident is receiving the highest level of secrecy classification. You are not to discuss this with anyone. To everyone, you finished your seasonal work early for health reasons. Understand? No details, no hints. This is not a request, Leo. It's an order. Yes, sir, I mumbled, feeling the weight of his words. I was housed in a temporary apartment on the base. The next 2 days I spent in a fog, sleeping in fits and starts, eating without appetite, answering the psychologist's monotonous questions. I didn't care about their diagnoses. I knew what I had seen. No psychologist could erase that. On the 3rd day, the phone rang. It was Dennis. His voice sounded muffled, almost frightened. Leo, hey. How are you holding up? Fine, I lied. Listen, I'm calling you unofficially, he whispered. The team finished up at the tower. They didn't find anything else. No fibers, no prints, no organic matter. Complete sterility, you understand? It's terrifying. What about the footprints? I blurted out. A long silence hung in the receiver. We got preliminary data from the trace evidence experts studying Carl's photos. Dennis spoke slowly with difficulty. The 3D model showed that the pressure is inconsistent with human biomechanics. The weight distribution, the angle of the foot, the density of impact, it all falls outside the parameters of a human step. We don't know what it is, but it's definitely not human, Leo. Something inside just screamed no. That thought just wouldn't settle in my head. It shattered my entire world into pieces. My so-called administrative leave turned into a real house arrest. I sat in that damned apartment, only going out for food, trying to read, but the letters swam before my eyes. Every night, the same thing, the spiral staircase and the silent shadow crawling up it. The park management had simply sidelined me. I became a problem for them, one that needed to be temporarily isolated. Fire me? No, that would raise too many questions. They were just waiting for me to calm down, accept it, and disappear into oblivion, but I couldn't. Fear gradually gave way to something else, much stronger, an obsessive need to understand. I am not one to believe in ghosts or demons. What I encountered was real. It left traces. It was recorded by a camera, which means it must have its own laws. Even if I didn't know them yet, I started my own investigation. Quiet, discreet, my only allies were my laptop and the internet. I went through the official Yellowstone archives. I searched for everything related to fire lookouts. Incidents, accidents, disappearances, sudden closures. Most of the information was sickeningly boring. Lightning strikes, damage from winter storms, decommissioning old equipment. For almost a week, I had been wading through dry reports and orders from the last 70 years until I finally stumbled upon something that hooked me. A brief mention of the decommissioning of the Osprey fire lookout flashed in a 1978 report. It was located deep in the northern part of the park, a remote area that was difficult to reach. The official reason for the write-off: budget optimization and unprofitability of maintaining the post due to low fire hazard in the sector. Something about that phrasing struck me as fake. Fire lookouts in Yellowstone are strategic assets. They aren't simply shut down because of some unprofitability. I began to dig deeper, looking for any clue related to Osprey Point. Information was extremely scarce. The tower was dismantled in 1979, with only a concrete foundation remaining. But I found the name of the last observer who worked there, Arthur Jennings. According to an internal memo, after the tower closed, he was transferred to an administrative position at the main office. Strange, right? A simple social media search gave me a result. Arthur Jennings, 72, retired, living in Bozeman, Montana. Only a couple of hours' drive from me. I hesitated for a long time about whether to do this. My agreement with Evans was unequivocal. I was supposed to keep silent. But the thirst for answers outweighed caution. I found his number and called. "Mr. Jennings?" I asked when a dry, elderly voice answered the phone. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Leo. Leo Riley. I worked as the observer at the Thoroughfare Lookout this season. I have a few questions for you about your experience at Osprey." There was a long pause. I thought he had hung up. "Thoroughfare," he finally said. "I heard it was closed for repairs. Unexpectedly, in the middle of the season." "Yes, sir, that's exactly why I'm calling. I don't give interviews, kid, and I advise you not to poke around in old business. I'm not a journalist, sir. I'm the one who was in the tower when they decided to close it. I think you understand what I mean." Silence again. It was different this time. Not irritated, but rather assessing. "The Main Street Cafe in Bozeman, tomorrow at 10 o'clock a.m., he said, and hung up. The next day, I was sitting at a table in the corner of the noisy cafe. Arthur Jennings turned out to be a fit, silver-haired old man with clear, piercing eyes. He brought his coffee and sat across from me, studying my face carefully. "You look just like I did back then," he said without preamble. "Like you haven't slept in a week and saw something you shouldn't have." "I saw someone climb the ladder to a locked door," I said quietly. "I saw tracks on the roof." "Quiet," he interrupted without raising his voice. "Never talk about this where someone could hear you. People like Evans, they can't stand that kind of stuff." Arthur chuckled. "Is he still working?" "Oh yes, where would he go?" "He was the one who conducted my interrogation. Guys like him don't change. Their thing isn't to investigate, it's to sweep things under the rug, to pour concrete over anything that doesn't fit their worldview. That's exactly what they did to my tower." "So, what happened there?" I asked, feeling a growing chill. "In the official reports, there is nothing there and never will be. Officially, a guy named Frank was in the tower before me. They said he went crazy from loneliness, had a psychosis, became erratic, so they wrote him off. And they closed the tower so there wouldn't be any more such cases. A nice little story, but it's not true at all. Frank was one of the most level-headed people I knew. He had worked there for 5 seasons. He wasn't crazy. He was just terrified. Scared to the bone. I replaced him for the last week before the closure. I didn't see what he saw, but that nasty feeling, like you're being watched, and not just from the woods, but from somewhere above. I felt that. And I also read his personal journal, the one he didn't hand over to his bosses." Arthur sipped his coffee, looking somewhere past me, as if seeing the past. "That's the crux of it, you see, in those personal notes. Official reports are just garbage. The real history of the park is written in diaries that are later burned or hidden. Frank wrote about the same thing as you, about someone who comes at night, climbs the ladder absolutely silently. He too initially thought it was a lost tourist, but then it started coming every night. Just stood outside the door, sometimes walked around the catwalk. My hands on the table felt like ice. This was my story, told by a man who heard it 40 years ago. But what did it want? Did it try to break in? No. That's the horror of it. Arthur looked back into my eyes and his gaze held a cold, creepy seriousness. It never showed aggression. It just studied. Frank wrote that the scariest part wasn't when it stood outside the door, but when he looked at it through the window. What did he see? I whispered. He wrote that it didn't pay any attention to him at all. It stood on the catwalk and looked inside the cabin, but not at Frank. In his final entry, the day before they took him away, Frank wrote, "It's looking at the firefinder." The firefinder? Yes, the Osborne firefinder. You know, that brass round table with the map and the LED in the center? Standard equipment in every lookout. You know what that is, right? Yes, of course. Frank was certain that this creature wasn't interested in him, but in that instrument, that map. He wrote that it could stand for hours just staring at it through the glass, as if trying to understand something, figure out its mechanism, and then it climbed onto the roof. Frank heard quiet footsteps overhead, and in the morning, they took him away. That's the whole story. Arthur finished his coffee and stood up. Listen to my advice, kid. Forget it. Take your severance pay, leave Montana and start a new life. You've peeked behind a curtain where there's nothing good. They won't let you get to the truth. They'll just pour concrete over your story, just like they did to my tower. He left me alone with this new, even more insane thought. A creature weighing hundreds of pounds, climbing to the locked doors of fire lookouts, not to attack people, but to study their navigational instruments. This was no longer just inexplicable, it was completely devoid of any conventional sense. Arthur's advice, forget it and leave, was sensible, logical, and the only right one from the standpoint of self-preservation. But I couldn't follow it. The information that the creature was interested in the firefinder turned everything upside down. This was no longer just a ghost story about a forest phantom. This was a real puzzle. My mind, honed for the systemic work of an observer, for finding patterns and analyzing data, simply couldn't let it go. The personal threat faded into the background, but this mystery, it consumed me whole. A few days later, I called Arthur again. I had no idea how to start, so I blurted out immediately. "Arthur, it's Leo again. You mentioned Frank's personal journal. Is there the slightest chance that it survived?" Silence hung on the other end of the line. I was expecting an annoyed sigh, but the voice. Arthur sounded exhausted. "Just drop it, kid. I told you," he grumbled. But I couldn't. That firefinder was stuck in my head. I needed to figure it out. Figure out what? Arthur sighed heavily. That there are things in this park that are better left alone. We're not the first and not the last. It's like the weather. You can't change it or fully understand it. You just live with it. "It exists," I burst out. Arthur sighed again. "Yes, it exists. I took it out of Frank's tower the day they sent me there. I knew the security people would turn everything upside down, and I didn't want them to find his notes. It would have been proof of his madness." "Where is it now?" I asked impatiently. "Not with me. Keeping something like that is insane. I gave it to a crank, a retired history professor from the University of Montana, Alistair Finch. He collects such artifacts, stories that didn't make it into the official chronicles. His brain works much better than all of our bosses. Arthur gave me the number, warning. Finch is a character. He doesn't like strangers. Don't tell him everything at once. He has to decide for himself if he can trust you. Good luck. This is my last gift to you. I'm not getting involved in this crap anymore. I found Dr. Finch's office in the old wing of the campus. It was a cave of knowledge, crammed to the ceiling with bookshelves, racks of boxes, and piled high with papers and maps. The air smelled of old paper, tobacco, and ancient mystery. Finch himself was a short, plump man with gray hair and surprisingly lively eyes behind thick glasses. "Mr. Riley," he said, gesturing me toward an armchair. "Arthur warned me about your call. He rarely recommends anyone. How can I be of assistance to a young man who has suddenly become so interested in the history of decommissioned fire lookouts?" I decided to follow Arthur's advice. "I'm conducting a personal investigation, sir. I'm interested in non-standard situations in the history of the Park Service. When the official reasons for closing facilities raise questions, like with the Osprey Point Tower." Finch smiled. "Ah, the budget optimization of 78. A wonderful example of official prose. But why does this interest you specifically? You worked at Thoroughfare, didn't you? I hear there's a structural evaluation going on there now. Another wonderful euphemism." He looked me straight in the eye, and I realized evading was useless. He knew more. "Because history seems to be repeating itself, sir, and I found myself at the center of it." "Repeating in detail?" he asked, and his eyes sparkled. Finch nodded. He silently stood up, walked to a bookshelf, and took down a plain cardboard box. Inside were several thick notebooks. "Frank Potter's journal," he said, placing the box on the table. "Arthur was right to save it. These are not just the notes of a frightened man. They are the report of a field researcher encountering something completely alien. You may read it." The first entries were mundane, but after about a year the tone changed. The first entry about the night guest appeared. At first, Frank, like me, thought it was a poacher. He described the same silent gait, the same climb up the ladder to the locked door. I flipped through the pages, and my own experiences, the terror, the feeling of being cornered, the bewilderment, were all reflected in his words, written 40 years ago. But Frank had been there longer. He started observing. He stopped being afraid and started analyzing. He marked every night the creature appeared. He noted that it wasn't aggressive. It just observed. Arthur was right. The thing stood on the catwalk for hours, peering inside through the glass, and its gaze was literally fixed on the Osborne firefinder. "It doesn't look at me," Frank scrawled. "I'm like furniture to it, part of the decor." It was only interested in the map, that brass circle, and the Alidad needle. It studied it, trying to figure out how it worked. But why? And then I got to the very last pages, the entries made literally before his breakdown. The handwriting was erratic, hurried, as if Frank was writing on a single breath, on the brink. "I found a pattern," he exclaimed on the paper. "What a fool I was not to notice this sooner. Its visits are not random. They don't depend on the weather or the phases of the moon, as we've assumed. They coincide with other events." I cross-referenced the dates of its appearances over the last 3 years with an astronomical calendar, and the hair stood up on my head. They coincided. They matched the peaks of meteor showers, the passages of certain comets, and the moments when specific constellations were directly at the zenith above the tower. Tonight is the peak of the Leonids. Frank wrote, and I know it will come. The next entry was even more shocking. I understand. I finally understand everything. What an irony. We sit in these towers, imagining ourselves as guardians of the forest, looking down at the ground. And all this time we should have been looking up. The Osborne Firefinder. We use it to determine the azimuth of a fire on the ground. But what if that's only a side function? A round map fixed in place. A rotating alidaya with a 360-degree scale. This is a primitive equatorial mount, an astronomical instrument. From such a height, without light pollution, with an accurate local map for referencing, it's a real observatory. Simple, but terrifyingly effective. I felt chills run down my spine. I turned the page. The last entry was written in shaky, broken handwriting. Just a couple of sentences. It's here, standing on the catwalk. But tonight it's not looking at the firefinder, it's looking at me. I think it figured out that I figured it out. God, all this time it wasn't looking at the Yellowstone map. It's using it to look at the stars. The Alidade isn't a pointer, it's a sight. And tonight that sight is pointing straight at the constellation Leo, where the meteors are flying from. It's pointing at... The entry simply broke off there, mid-sentence. I imagined Frank sitting in a cabin just like mine, writing these lines with a silent shadow outside the glass. And this time, it's looking not at the instrument but at him, because he had solved its secret. When I finished the last broken line in Frank's journal, I slowly closed the notebook. The air in Finch's office suddenly felt heavy, stale. This was more than just confirmation of my suspicions. It was a verdict. The knowledge I had gained was poisonous. It transformed me from a mere witness into an accomplice, or even worse, into an obstacle. Do you understand now? Finch asked quietly, looking at me over his glasses. His face was serious, all curiosity gone, replaced by grim concern. As long as they were just stories about a night guest, it was folklore, a safe secret. But what you and Frank discovered, that's no longer a fairy tale, that's mechanics. That's a description of a process. And those who manage this park cannot allow anyone to understand how their primary anomaly works. What did they do to Frank? I managed to ask, though I seemed to already know the answer. Nothing cruel, no violence, Finch replied. It was all done quietly and with medical precision. He was diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia caused by prolonged isolation, placed in a good private clinic in Oregon. His stories about star maps and sky observers became perfect confirmation of the diagnosis for the doctors. He was simply erased. Discredited and isolated for the rest of his days, he died of a heart attack 10 years ago. I stood up and walked to the window. Students on campus were laughing, living their normal lives, completely unaware of the boxes of impossible stories in the old professor's office. I felt infinitely distant from them. Now they'll come for me, I said, more stating a fact than asking a question. They're already looking for you, Finch replied. Arthur called me an hour ago. People from the service came to him. The agents were pressuring Arthur, checking if he had been in contact with me. Methodically, without shouting, but with a cold certainty that made their words suffocating. Arthur was deflecting, but he wasn't built for that kind of pressure and would break sooner or later. They quickly figured out. I wasn't just hiding, I was digging. This something was more dangerous to them than just my attempt to disappear. I was on a trail leading to their secrets. My phone vibrated. Denny. The call I was waiting for and dreading. I answered. Leo? His voice held a false cheerfulness. Yes, Denise. My voice sounded level, but everything inside me was tightening. Leo, Mr. Evans wants to meet with you. We need to conduct a final interview. Close the formalities on your case. He asks you to come to the base tomorrow at 9 o'clock. This is important, Leo. Final interview sounded like a death sentence. My path was supposed to end like Frank's, in a basement, under pressure, in an unmarked grave. They were going to shut me down. I'll be there, I lied, hanging up immediately. I hadn't even put the phone down when Finch's voice came from the darkness. He had been there all this time, invisible, like a shadow. You don't have tomorrow, Mr. Riley. His low, calm voice carried absolute certainty. It seemed he had heard the entire conversation, or he simply knew. You have a few hours at most. Finch's words were the final push. I bolted from the university, not looking back, leaving everything that was part of Leo Riley, a man who no longer existed. I withdrew all the cash from the bank, a meager amount, but my only chance. I sped north toward the Canadian border to throw them off my scent. Halfway there, I sharply turned east, deeper into the country. My phone, into the river, a symbolic farewell to my past life. I bought an old clunker for cash and drove on, dissolving into the flow of roads. 6 months of constant flight, fear, and transformation. Now I'm in Chicago, a giant city where it's easy to get lost. My story is one of millions, lost in this chaos. I rented a closet-sized room in a neighborhood where no one asks too many questions. I worked under the table for cash, as a loader, a washer, a handyman. Any job without papers or a trace. I grew a beard, cut my hair, changed my gait and manner of speaking. Leo Riley is dead. In his place is someone else, without a name or a past. Fear mutated, becoming more subtle and pervasive. Now I don't fear a knock on the door. That fear has become background noise. Now I fear the clear night sky. Astronomy has sucked me in like quicksand. I downloaded software for modeling the night sky and observatory databases onto an old laptop. At night, I tried to find in the numbers and maps what was escaping me. I needed to decipher Frank's last sentence, his dying message. The key to this story, to what they were hiding, was in the stars. I started with Frank's tower, Osborne. I entered its coordinates and the date time of the last entry, 2347 November 17th, into the program, modeling the star positions. And what did I see? The peak of the Leonid meteor shower, bright streaks of light. This was no coincidence. Frank was a meticulous observer. His firefinder in the tower was oriented with incredible precision. I drew a line from the tower's coordinates, aimed precisely at the radiant of the meteor shower, the point from which the meteors originated. This was the vector that Frank wanted to show me. And then it hit me, like lightning struck my brain. Not just an epiphany, but a real electrical shock that pierced every cell of my consciousness, burning out old notions of the world and replacing them with a new, terrifying reality. Two horrifying things became crystal clear, as plain as day, and this clarity was worse than any blindness, for it revealed the abyss to me. First, it turned out they weren't just staring at us for no reason. No, this wasn't passive observation, curiosity, or idle study of primitive life forms. They are coordinating something, as if conducting an invisible orchestra whose instruments are the very fabric of our world, and the symphony is a harbinger of catastrophe. Imagine these towers of ours poking up everywhere. Cell antennas, radio masts, even ordinary power lines are not just infrastructure elements to them. To them, they are simply theodolites, high-precision, geodesic instruments with which they measure, calibrate, and adjust something beyond our comprehension. Every impulse, every signal we consider ordinary data traffic is a reference point for them, a marker in their grand alien system. And the distant stars in the night sky are not just twinkling lights, not objects for romantic dreams or scientific research. To them, they are their ancient reference points, lighthouses in the cosmic void against which they check their coordinates over eons. They were using our, as we think, advanced but essentially primitive technology, our electronics, our networks, our satellites, not to understand us, but for their own unknown navigation, to build their own invisible map. While we were proud of our achievements in communication and information, they, like clever parasites, were weaving their threads into our digital web, redirecting energy and data flows for their own purposes. They were drawing some invisible vectors, lines of force, information streams that we could neither see, feel, nor even imagine. These vectors permeated continents, crossed oceans, rose into the stratosphere, and went deep underground. And all these lines, believe me, converged at one single, horrifying point. Not just a geographic coordinate, but some energetic or even spatio-temporal node that is the heart of their operations. It's not just a place on the map. It's the epicenter of their influence, their control center, their damned lair, from which they, like a spider in the center of its web, feel our every movement, our every breath. And the realization of this was like suddenly understanding that your own house is not just a house, but a meticulously designed cage, and you are merely an object in an alien experiment. Second, a cold sweat broke out on me that had nothing to do with the air temperature. It was the sweat of animal terror, chilling me to the bone. I realized that I will never be safe now. And it's not about Evans or those tedious park services, with their petty rules and bureaucratic threats. They are nothing at all compared to this. Their concerns, their power, their existence, all seemed insignificant. Dust in the wind before the cosmic, all-encompassing threat I had just realized. No. Now I don't just know how they work. I, damn it, know where their center is, their damned lair. This knowledge wasn't the result of logical inferences or deduction. It simply flashed within me, like an intuitive insight, an absolute, undeniable truth. I felt it as you feel cold or pain, as you feel your own heart beating. And this knowledge, unlike myself, is simply impossible to hide in the hustle and bustle of a big city. It's not just information in my head. It has become a part of me. It radiates from me, like heat from a living body. It's like a beacon that now shines directly on me, piercing the darkness and indicating my location to them. I have become a target, not because I did something, but because I know. This knowledge is not a shield, but a curse that makes me visible to those who have remained invisible to us until now. Every rustle, every glance, every random passerby now seems like a potential agent, part of their invisible network. The city, which was once a refuge, has now turned into a labyrinth where every turn can lead to an inevitable encounter. I feel their presence everywhere. Their invisible vectors penetrate the air. Their theodolite towers scan every corner. My mind, having once discovered this terrifying truth, cannot now close. I am doomed to carry this burden forever, to be a beacon in their endless silent hunt, and I know that sooner or later they will come for me. The only question is when, and what they will do when they find me.